Hey, what's going on, guys? So yesterday I made a text post on YouTube letting you know that I won't be making YouTube videos for the next few weeks or so, and I still do plan to upload projects from other courses. So today we're going to actually do 5 different mini projects with HTML, CSS, and vanilla JavaScript, and these 5 are from my 50 projects in 50 days course on Udemy. So if you're interested, I'll have a link to that course in the description with a promo code. So I just want to go through the 5 projects real quick. So the first one is going to be this blurry loading page. So if I reload, you'll see that the image starts off blurry and this percentage goes from 0 to 100 and the image comes in clearly. So that's the first one. The second one is going to be this vertical slider. So we have an image on this side, some text on the left, and we can just scroll through and we can go the other way as well. All right, so that's the second project. Third one is going to be this random choice picker. So we can go ahead and put some choices in here separated by commas. So choice 2, choice 3, and if we hit enter, it's going to do this little effect down here and it's going to randomly pick one of those choices. Next, we have a live user filter. So we have a list of users here. Obviously, you could replace this with anything. And then we can just start to type and we'll filter down Edna, and you can see it filters that user. And then the last one is going to be this content placeholder project where when we come to the page, we have this cool little effect until the data sets in. Okay, so all of these use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And then I'll also have the GitHub repository for the 50 projects in 50 days. And obviously it includes those 5 projects. And one thing I want to mention is there is a project starter. So this is where I basically begin each project, and it's nothing special. You just have your HTML head body tags, you're linking in the script, and you're linking in the CSS. And then in the style.css, I just have the font that I'm using, which is Roboto, and a reset, and then some body styles, basically positioning everything into the middle with Flexbox. So you're just going to want to add this. The JavaScript file is completely empty. All right, so that's the starter, that's the repository, and let's get started with the first project. Okay, so in this project, we're going to be building a blurry loading page or loading image. So if I come to this page here, you'll see that the image starts blurred, and we also start with 0%, and then that goes up to 100%, and the image comes into focus. So you could use this to load just about anything. We're just doing a blur effect on the image, but you could load in your site. You could have any other elements in the DOM load in that specific amount of time from when we go to 0 to 100. And we'll have to map different number ranges to the 0 to 100 load. For instance, the image blur is going to be 30 pixels when it starts, and it's going to go down to 0 as we go from 0 to 100. And there's a Stack Overflow function that we're going to use to help us do that, to help us map one number range to another. All right, so that's it. Let's get started. So we're going to get started on the blurry loading project, and the HTML is going to be really simple. There's actually only 2 lines in the body, but let's add a title here. So we'll call this blurry loading. And then down here, let's get rid of the H1, and this is going to be a section. I'm going to give this a class of BG. So this is going to be the background image that we blur. And then we'll have around the text, we'll have a class of loading dash text, and we just want to put in here 0%. And that should do it as far as the HTML goes. So let's jump into our style sheet. And there's not too much we have to do here either. I'm going to change the font. So I just want this to be googleapis.com/CSS. And we want to use a font family. I'm going to use a family of Ubuntu. If I can spell family correctly. And then let's change down here, change Roboto to Ubuntu. And then this stuff can really all stay the same. We don't have to change anything here. We don't need flex direction column, but it's not going to hurt if you do leave it. Now for the background, remember we have that section with the class of BG, and we want to set a background. Actually, let's just use the background property and say we want this to be a URL, and the actual image that I'm going to use, I'm just going to copy and paste in. Of course, you can use any image you want. If you want to use this one, you can get it from the link from the repository. So let's make this have no repeat. Let's make it center, center on the X and Y axis, and cover for the background position. And we want to position this absolute. And then let's set the top. So I'm going to initially just set the top in left to 0. I'm going to change this and I'll show you why in a couple minutes. And then the width, we'll set that to 100 viewport widths, and the height to 100 viewport height. So we just wanted to take up the whole viewport. And let's add a Z index here of -1 because we want this to be behind the 0% or whatever the percentage is, the text. And we want to add a filter here, and initially the blur is going to be set to 0 pixels. And then for the loading text, we just want to increase the font size. Let's set that, we'll set the font size to 50 pixels, and let's set the color to white. Really depends on the background image you use. All right, so that gives us this. Now I just want to show you something. Because this is going to start blurry and then it's going to make its way up, or make its way down, I should say. The higher the pixels for the blur, the more blurry it is. So if I put like 70 pixels in here, that's what it looks like. Now notice on the edges, this comes out quite a bit. So I actually want to fix that. I don't want it to come out that much. So for the top and left, I'm going to set that to -30 pixels. And let's also set the left to -30 pixels. Now if I do that, you're going to see there's less spacing on the left and the top, but there's more over here. So for the width and the height, what we can do is calculate. So we can use calc and just wrap this, and we just want to add 60 pixels like that, and now you can see that it's even on the left and right. We want to do the same for the top and bottom, so we'll do the same thing. We'll just calc, and we want to add 60 pixels here as well, and now there's not as much space. All right, so I think that that looks a little better. So let's put this back to 0 pixels. So in the next video, we want to add our JavaScript so that we can have this image basically start blurry and then have it work its way up to being clear as this percentage loads here. So now we want to work on actually having this percentage change. So we want it to go from 0 to 100, and then the background image is going to start blurry and then it's going to go to clear as this loads. So first thing, we'll just bring in the two elements we have, which are the load text. So let's say document.query selector, query selector, and we have a class of text, or what we call loading text. And then we also want the background, so that has a class of BG, and we'll just call this BG. Okay, now I'm going to initialize a value here called load, which is going to start at 0. Obviously, it's going to go from 0 to 100. And we're going to have a function here called blurring. And right now, I just want to take that load value and increment it by 1. And then I'm going to go ahead and just console log load. Now, the way we want to run this function is in an interval, and I want it to run every 30 milliseconds. So let's create a variable here called int. So we'll say let int and set this to set interval. And the function we want to run is the blurring function, and let's say every 30 milliseconds. Okay, this is not 30 seconds, this is 30 milliseconds, which is very quick. So I'm going to save this, and if we go and we open up our dev tools here and we go to the console, you're going to see it's just going to go from 0 and it's going to increment every 30 milliseconds forever. It's just going to keep going. Obviously we don't want that. We want it to go from 0 to 100. So what we'll do here, actually I'll leave the console log for now, and let's say if the load value is greater than 99, then we want to stop that interval, and the way we do that is with the clear interval function. So we want to pass in int because that represents this set interval. So now if I save that, when it gets to 100 it should stop. Okay, so that's what we want. Now, instead of just console logging, obviously we have some stuff in the DOM that we want to work with, that we want to change. One is going to be the text. So let's take the load text and set the inner text value. And I'm going to set that to, let's use some template string here, and we want the load, okay, whatever that is at the time, and then just a percentage sign. So if I save that, you'll see that this will start counting up to 100. And also the way that I want this to show is not only count up to 100, but it's going to start fully opaque, and then it's going to start to fade out as it loads up. All right, so what we'll do is take the load text and set the opacity. So let's say style.opacity. .opacity. And this is going to be tricky because the opacity value isn't going to be the load value, because that goes from 0 to 100. Opacity goes from 0 to 1, right? So it's going to start at, or actually in our case we want it to start full, fully opaque, so 1, and we want it to go to 0. So we have to map a range of numbers, there's basically 0 to 100, to going from 1 to 0 in the same amount of time. Now, there's actually a Stack Overflow post that we're going to use here to reference. And this person asks, either in JavaScript or jQuery, to map a range of numbers to another range of numbers, because that's what we want to do. We want to map 0 to 100 to 1 to 0 for the opacity. And this is the question here, but the answer that I want to show you is this one here. So it's pretty simple. It takes in a number, it takes in the minimum and the maximum of the in number, which in our case is going to be 0 and 100, so the load, and then outmin is going to be 1, opacity 1, and then outmax is going to be 0, okay, because we want it to go from solid to disappeared. So I'm going to actually put this link here. I'm going to put this at the bottom of the file, just in case you need to look at it. And then I'm going to grab this function here called scale, and we're going to put this right here. And then what we can do is, when we're setting this opacity, we'll run it through scale, and we're going to pass in the number, which is load. So that's the amount of time that we want this stuff to happen. So when that goes from 0 to 100, we want to map opacity from 1 to 0. If we were starting invisible and going to opaque, then we would do 0, 1, but we're doing it the other way around. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's go to the page here, and I'm going to save, and this will run, and now you can see it's going to just slowly fade out as it gets closer to 100. All right, so this is actually a really handy little function. Let's put this, put this right up here so we know that goes with that. And Stack Overflow is great for little functions like this to do a specific task. Now we have to do the same thing for the blur, because I don't want the blur to be from 100 pixels. I want it to be 30. 30 is the max. So actually I'll just show you right here. If I set in the CSS, that's the max blur I want to do. I don't want to set this to 100 like that. So we have to map the 0 to 100 to 30 to 0, because we're going to start blurred. So we want to start at 30 pixels and bring it down to 0 when the load is done. So let's take the BG, the background, and let's take style. We want to do style.filter, and we're going to set that to template literal, and let's say blur. And inside here, inside blur, we're going to open up our variable syntax, or expression syntax, and we're going to call scale. And we want to scale the load, just like we did with the opacity. And it's going to be from 0 to 100 for that load. And then we want the blur to go from 30 to 0 in that same amount of time that load goes from 0 to 100. So let's save that. And oh, I forgot pixels. So we have to have the number. You have to have px in here. So after this expression, we'll do px, and there we go. So now you can see that the background image is going to go from a blur of 30 pixels down to 0 in the same amount of time that the load goes from 0 to 100. Same thing with the opacity of the number. Alright, so that's pretty much it. And of course you could load in anything you want. I chose to do just an image and blur it in, but you know, you could add other effects with stuff that you add to the HTML, that you add to the DOM. But that's it for this project. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one. All right, welcome to your next project. So in this one, we're going to build a vertical slider. Basically, we have an image on this side and we have some text on this side, and this could be any kind of content you want. And then these two arrows here, if I click the up, what's going to happen is one side goes up, one side goes down, but it brings into place the correct text area and the correct image. So I'll go up again. So we have 4 different slides. If I click up again, it just goes back to the beginning. Same with down. So then it just goes the opposite way. So I think it's a really cool looking slider. It's not really responsive. If we make this smaller, you can see it doesn't really look good on smaller screens just because of the orientation of it. But that's not really the point here. This is made for, you know, a desktop, laptop, etc. If you wanted to, you could go on and try to maybe switch the orientation on smaller screens, but we're going to go ahead and build this out. I think it's a really cool looking project, so let's get started. Okay, so we're going to get started on our vertical slider. Now I have my browser window quite wide because this isn't really responsive just because of the orientation of how the slider is. So it's not going to look good on like a smartphone or anything like that. That's not really what this is geared for. So I'm going to just keep this a little wider and just click back and forth for now. In our HTML, we just have our project starter, and I have a link to the font awesome CDN because we will be using icons for the buttons. So let's start off here. Let's change this to vertical slider. And then we're going to have a container that wraps around everything. So let's give this div a class of slider-container, and there's basically three separate parts. First we have the left dash slide, so this is going to be, you know, the text area, so we'll have an H1 and a paragraph, and then the right slide, and I'll fill these in a little bit, but the right slide is going to be the images, right? So they're just basically just going to be divs with background images. And then underneath that, we want our buttons. So let's say action dash buttons. And our first button here is going to have a class of down dash button. And I'm going to use a font awesome icon, so FAS, and we want FA dash arrow dash down. Okay, so I'll go ahead and save that. Wait, is that right? No, FAS space arrow down. And then for the up arrow, we'll just take this button, copy it down, and we'll change this to up and change this icon to up. And now we have our buttons. So for the left slide, let's go into that div, and we're just going to have a bunch of divs with an H1. So for this H1, we'll say nature, flower, and a paragraph. We'll say all in pink. And then each div is going to have an inline style with a background color, so that way when you want to add new slides or new divs, you just throw the background color in here rather than creating a whole separate class for it. So let's say background color, and we'll make it FD3555. So if I save it, we're going to see that. Now we're going to have 3 more of these, which I'm just going to paste in because it's the same thing, it's just different colors and content. So if I save that, you can see what we have here. Now for the right slide is going to be just a bunch of background images. So I'm going to grab that, and I'm just using links to Unsplash images, just to stock images. So you can see we have a div with a background image URL, and we have 4 of these. Now if I save, we're not going to see these right now because we don't have any content within the div and there's no height or width applied to the element. So we're not going to see the images just yet. Now one thing I want to mention is because of the way this slides, one side goes up, one side goes down, we have this first div this nature flower is actually going to go with the last image div here. All right, so if I look at this last image, I'm just going to copy that URL and paste that in. You can see that's the pink flower. So the way you would do this if you want to add more is if you add one on to the end here, you're going to add one on to the beginning here. Okay, see the last one here is Flying Eagle, and if we take a look at this, we get the Flying Eagle. So that's the order of the elements. So now let's jump into our CSS and let's get started here. So as far as the font goes, I'm going to use Open Sans. So let's say family equals Open plus Sans. And we're going to change this to Open Sans. Okay, and I can make this smaller here. So we'll make that smaller and make this a little smaller for now. Now the body, we actually don't need all this stuff like display flex. I just want the font family, and I want the height to be 100 viewport heights. So it's going to look like that right now. And I want to just set a reset on the margin and padding. So for the universal selector, we'll set margin and padding to 0. That's going to remove the margin and padding from everything. Now, as far as the slider container goes, which is wrapped around everything, so the slider container, I'm going to set the position to relative because we're going to be setting everything inside of it as absolute within that container. And then just setting the overflow to hidden and set the width to 100 viewport widths, so VW, which will take the whole width, and same with the height. This is going to be VH, viewport heights. All right, and then we'll go ahead and start on the left slide. So for the left slide, I want to set the height to 100%, and let's set the, actually let's do the width first. So the width is going to be 35% of the container. Okay, the image part is going to be a little bigger. The image part will be 65%, and we're going to position this absolute, and from the top 0, and from the left 0. And then what we want to do is target the immediate divs inside, which are each of these here. So let's say left slide immediate div, and I want to set for that the height. I want the height to be the entire thing. So one of these should take up the entire height. So the div will be 100. Do 100%, and then width will be 100%, but it's 100% of its container, which is 35%. So if I save that, now we can see this nature flower, and it takes up the entire height here. And when we add the slide functionality, it'll show the next one. Now we want to style this a little better, so let's display flex. So each div will be display flex. Now it's in a row right now. That's why it's horizontal. So we want to change the flex direction to a column, and then we can align both horizontally and vertically. So align center, align item center, and then let's justify content center, and that'll align it that way. And then let's also make the color white. Okay, and then let's grab the H1, so left slide H1, and let's set the font size to be a little bigger. We're going to set that to 40 pixels, and we'll add a little bit of margin bottom, because remember we took the margin off of everything, 10 pixels to separate it from the paragraph part. And then I just want to move it up a little bit, so margin top, I'll set a negative margin, 30 pixels, which will pull it up a little bit. Alright, so that's the left slide. Now the right slide, let's say right slide, I'm going to set the height to 100%. I'm going to position absolute from the top 0, and then from the left I'm going to go 35% because this width is 35%. So for the right slide, I'm positioning it absolute within the container, so I want to start it here, which would be 35% over from the left. All right, and then we want to set the width of it to 65%. Okay, and then to actually show the image, let's target the div. So right slide, direct div. And I just want to set some background properties like background repeat. Set that to no repeat. We already have the background image set inline, right? That's already set right here. So I just want to add some other background properties like the size. So let's see, background size is going to be cover. We want to show the whole image. And then background position is going to be centered on the X and Y axis. We still can't see it because we need to apply a height to it. So height and width are going to both be 100%, so it takes up the whole part there. And now we can see the image. Now this isn't the image that we actually want to show with this nature flower, but like I said, since the way that we're sliding them in, when we get to our JavaScript, we're going to set it so that this is the right text or the right left slide for this image. But for now, let's go ahead and style our buttons. So we're going to have some general button styles, but before we do that, I just want to target the slider container action, what do I call it? Action dash buttons and button. And I mean, we could put the general styling in here as well, but just in case you wanted to add other buttons somewhere. So this is going to be positioned absolute. And as soon as I do that, you can see up here, now there's two buttons here, but they're both in the same exact spot right now. I'm going to move both to a position of left 35%. Okay, so that's going to push them over. And then let's go from the top, we'll go down about halfway. We'll say 50% down. So now both buttons are right here. And we want to make sure they're always on top. So let's do a Z index of 100. All right, and then for the down button, so let's grab this here and say class down dash button. I'm going to set a border. Actually, let's position it first. So we can use transform and then translate on the x-axis, because what I want to do is move this button over this way to the left. So if we put a positive number in here, I'm going to just do 100% of the element. It's going to move it over to the left, which I don't want. I want it over to the right, so that's going to be, I'm sorry, that's going to move it to the right. I want it to the left, so that's going to be negative. So now it's on either side of this line right here. All right, and then as far as the borders go, actually, you know what? We'll do that in a second. Let's first do the up button. So this one is going to be up button, and we want to actually move this one down. So we're going to do translate Y. I'm sorry, not move it down, move it up. This one here, I want to move up 100%. So we'll do negative 100%. So now you can see the positioning of these arrows. Now for the styling, so the general button styling, let's go up here to button, and let's set a background color of white. And let's get rid of the border, so border none. And let's make the color a gray, we'll do AAA. And let's make the cursor a pointer. Let's make the font size a little bigger, we'll do 16 pixels. Let's do padding, 15 pixels all the way around. Okay, so you can see that looks a little nicer. And on hover, let's say button, hover. Set the color to 222, which is a little darker, and we don't want any outline, so any button in the focus state, we want to set the outline to none. All right, now if we hover over, it gets darker. Now I do want to have some rounded corners on the bottom for this one and for the top for this one. So down where we have these down and up buttons, let's just add on the down button, we'll say border, we're going to say border, this is the down button, so let's do top top left radius and set that to 5 pixels. So you can see that this has the rounded corners here. And then we're going to do bottom left radius. So now this side is rounded. I want to do the same on this one, but the opposite side. So I'll just copy that, and instead of left, let's take this and change that to right. Okay, so now those buttons look pretty good. Okay, and it's obviously this doesn't do anything yet because we need to add our JavaScript. So that's what we're going to do in the next video. Okay, so now we're going to start on the JavaScript to get this to function and slide. So in our script.js, I'm going to go ahead and bring everything that we need in. So let's bring in our slider container, and we're going to use document.querySelector and select by the class of slider-container. And then we're going to bring in a couple other things. So this is going to be the right slide. So class of right-slide. And for the variable here, we'll call this slide right. And then we're also going to have slide left. And that's going to have that has the class of left-slide. All right, then we also want the buttons. So we have the up button, up-button, and we have the down-button. And let's call this one up button, down button. And then I also want to get the length of the slides, meaning how many slides do we have. So let's say slides length, and we'll set this to query selector all, because what we're selecting is all the divs, and we actually don't want all the divs in the document. We want all the divs that are in the slide right. Okay, so basically all those divs with the background images. So in here we want to query selector all the divs. That'll give us all the elements, but we just need the length. So we'll use the length property here, and that will give us, it will give us 4 in this case. If I console log slides length, and I go over here and open this up, you can see that we get 4. Okay, so you'll be able to add more or less slides if you want. Now we want to have an active slide index, because basically these are positioned to be like on top of each other. We need to know which index is basically in view. So let's say active slide index. Make sure you use let here, and we'll set that to 0 to start with. And let's take the slide left, okay, and then we're going to add a style, and we want to apply the top and set that to a set of backticks, and we want to do negative because this is actually going to go up, and the initial top value is going to be negative, and then put in our expression syntax here, and then some parentheses, and we want to take the slide length and subtract by 1, because the length is going to be 4. However, the index is 0 base, so the index will be like 0, 1, 2, 3. Even though there's 4 total, it starts at 0. So we want to get the last index, which in this case would be 3, which would be the 4th slide. Okay, because arrays are nodeless, they're 0 based. And then we want to multiply that by 100, because it takes up 100% or 100 viewport heights. So let's add here VH. All right, now if I save that and I go back, notice that this has moved to the correct position. So flying eagle actually goes with this image here. Now we just want to add functionality so we can, flick these up and down. One side will go up, one side will go down, and it should bring the correct slides into place. So let's take the up button, and let's add an event listener for a click. And when that happens, we're going to run, we'll call this function change slide, and we'll pass in an argument of up. Okay, and then I'm going to copy this down, and then this one's going to call down, and this is going to be on the down button. So let's change this here to down button. So they're both going to call the same function, they're just going to get passed in a different argument. So let's create our function. We'll use an arrow, so we'll say change slide equals, and it's going to take in a direction as a parameter. And then let's get the slider height, so we'll say const slider height, and that's going to be the slider container. And then there's a property called client height, okay, which will give us just that. In fact, we can console log just so you can see what that gives us. Slider height, and if I go over here and I click the up button, we get 666. Is that a bad sign? Let's click up again, 577. So it's based on whatever, whatever the height is here. And it's going to be completely dynamic. Doesn't matter how, high or small it is. So that'll give us whatever the slider height is. Now let's check for the direction that's being passed in. If the direction is, let's say, equal to up, then what we're going to want to do is take the active slide index, and increment that by 1, so plus plus. And then we want to know what happens if we hit the end. So let's say if the active slide index happens to be greater than the last index in the slide, which we can get with slide length. Slide length. But we want to take away 1 from that. So if that's true, then we'll set the active slide index to 0, back to the beginning. So basically, if we get to the end, we're going to go back to the beginning. All right. Now, if I click on up, you can see nothing is happening yet because we need to add a transform. We need to translate it on the y-axis, basically move it up and down. So down here, after the if, I'm going to take the slide. We're going to have to move both slide left and slide right. So let's take the right. So slide right, and set the style dot transform, and we want to translate the y on the y-axis. So translate y, and what we want to pass in here is negative because we want the right side to go up, and then our expression syntax, and we want the active slide index multiplied whatever the slider height is, because remember the slider height is variable, and then we just want to add pixels onto it. So if I save that, I go over here and I click up, nothing happens. Let's see, slide length is not defined. Slide length is not defined. Oh, it's slides length, plural. All right, so let's try that, and there we go. So you can see that it switches. Now, if I do it and it's at a certain height and then the height changes, you can see it kind of bleeds over. If I click it again, it's going to then recalculate the height based on this right here, okay, which we put into this variable, which we're using down here. Now I want it to actually have a smooth transition rather than just flicking over. So let's go back to our style sheet, and let's see, we want to go on both the left and right slides. So let's go up to the left slide here, and let's add a transition. So we want to transition the transform property, which is what we're changing in our JavaScript, and we'll do a 0.5 seconds and ease in out. And then I want to do the same thing for right. So right here we'll add that as well, and let's see what happens here. All right, so now you can see it has that transition, and when we get to the end, it just goes back to the beginning. Okay, so now we want the same for this side, because right now we're just switching the images. This is staying the same. So let's grab this here and paste that in, and then we want to say slide left and change the transform value, translate y, and we just want to make this positive because we want it to go the other way, right? So active slide index times slider height pixels. So now if I click up, there we go. All right, so it just goes the opposite way. Now the down button doesn't do anything, so up here where we have this if direction is up, let's go right out. Let's put an else here. Actually, let's do an else if. So else if the direction is equal to down, then we're basically going to do something similar to what we did here. So we can copy that, but we want to decrement this. So minus minus will take away 1, and we want to check to see if we're at the beginning. So if this is going to be less than 0, so if that's going to be less than 0, then we're going to set it to the last slide in the index, which is going to be whatever the slide's length is minus 1. Because the length for us at least is 4, but the last index would be 3 because it's 0, 1, 2, 3 as the indexes. So let's save that, and now if we click down, there we go, and it should always match up with the correct, the correct text with the correct image. All right, so that's it. Hopefully you enjoyed this project. I think it's a pretty cool looking slider. So that's it. I'll see you in the next project. So this is a cool little project for picking random choices. Now we have this text area, and as soon as I start to type, like I'll say choice 1, and you'll see it'll format down here as like a tag. And to create another choice, I just need to put a comma and start to type again, say choice 2, another comma, choice 3, choice 4. Obviously I can do as many as I want, and then as soon as I hit enter, it's going to give us this cool little effect, and it's going to stop on a random choice. It's also going to clear the text area. All right, so if you just need if you need some little helper to help you make a choice between however many items, however many objects, I mean, you could do numbers here, and it's just going to stop on a random one. Okay, so that's what we'll be creating. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, let's get started on our random choice picker. So I have my project starter here. I'm going to go ahead and just change the title here to random choice picker. And let's go down here. So we're going to have a container. We can get rid of the H1. Let's put a class of container here, and inside the container we'll have an H3, and let's say enter all of the choices divided by a comma. Go ahead and just specify what a comma is. Florin. And then let's do a line break here, and then we'll say press enter when you are done. All right, so under the H3, let's put a text area, and this is going to have an ID. We'll call text area, real creative. And let's have we don't need this stuff here because we're going to style it with CSS, and then we don't need a name. I do want a placeholder though, so let's say placeholder, and we'll go ahead and set that to enter choices here, ... Now under the text area, we're going to have an area for the tags. So we'll give this an ID of tags, and these are going to be spans with the class of tag, and obviously with some text of the different choices, but this is going to get inserted with the JavaScript. However, for now, I'm just going to hard code it just so we can see it and style it. So we'll just create a tag here. Let's say choice 1. We'll just add 3 of these, so we'll do 2, 3, and save. Okay, so that should do it for the HTML. Let's jump into our CSS, and so font family, we'll keep Roboto, that's fine. Let's add a background color. Background color is going to be hexadecimal value 2B88F0, which is a blue color. And we have display flex and flex direction column, center, that. Yeah, so all this is fine. So now the H3, let's give that a color of white because it's on that blue background. And let's also just add a little bit of margin. We'll do 10 pixels, 0, 20 pixels for the margin. You know what, let's change the font to Mully. So CSS question mark family equals Mully. And let's go right here in the body and change this. There we go. So that's a little bit more readable. And then for the container, we'll set a width of the container to 500 pixels. And actually, yeah, that should do it. So we have a 500 pixel container. Let's do the text area. So that has a class of text area. And I want to get rid of the border. So we'll say border none. And let's make this a block level element, so display block, and we're going to set the width to 100% of its container, which is not working. And that's because I gave it an ID of text area. So we'll just style the text area. So just take away that dot. There's no class. The height of this is going to be 100 pixels. And let's inherit the font family of Mully. And then let's add some padding. We'll do 10 pixels padding. And as far as margin goes, we'll do 0, 0, 20 pixels. And then let's make the font size a little bigger, 16 pixels. And then that should be good for the text area. Now for the tags, so we have spans with the class of tag, and we're going to add a background color. So background color is going to be F0932B. It's going to be the background, and the color of the text is going to be white, and we're going to add a border radius of 3 pixels. And I'm sorry, not 3 pixels, 50 pixels. And padding, we'll do 10 top and bottom, 20 left and right. And let's spread them out a bit, so we'll add margin. Let's do 0 top, 5, 10, and 0. And the font size, I'm going to make 14 pixels. Make that a little smaller. Let's display as inline block, and yeah, so that should do it. Now when it selects when it selects something at random, it's going to have a background color. So we'll have, in addition to tag, it'll have a class of highlight, and I just want to change the background color to hexadecimal value 273 C75. And just to see what that looks like, let's say the second one here, we add highlight, and the highlighted one will look like that. Okay, so that's it for the user interface here. So in the next video, we'll go ahead and we'll start to add our JavaScript. Alright, so in this video we want to create our tags. We want to be able to type in here and split by a comma and create tags below. So one thing I want to do in the CSS though is on the H3, I'm just going to add a text align of center just to center that. I think that looks a little better. And then in our script file, we want to get the tags element, which is this right here, this div with the ID of tags. So let's call this tags L and set that to document.getElementById, and we want the ID of tags. And then I also want the text area, so we have an ID of text area, and let's call this text area. And those are the only two things we want to bring in. So then I want to automatically focus on the text area, so we're going to call the focus method, which if we go to the page, it'll automatically put the cursor in there and we can start typing. Now we want an event listener on the text area, so add event listener, And we want to listen for a key up. So you have key down and key up. We're listening when you press down and then you let go, that's going to fire this off. And when that happens, let's pass in our event parameter here. When that happens, we're going to call a function called create tags, and we want to pass in e.target.value, which is going to be whatever we type in. So if we create a function called create tags, say input, and we console log the input, if we go down here and we open up our console and I start to type, you should see what we type down here. All right, now the way we're going to do this is we want to take whatever we type in and then we put a comma. We want to split at that comma and create an array of whatever is on either side of these commas. So this would create an array with this as the first value, this is the second. We can do that using split. So let's say const tags, and let's set that to input, which is a string. We want to split it by the comma and turn it into an array. So now if I console log here tags, and I go and I say, let's just put a 1 in here. Whoops, what happens? Split is not a function. So split, if I put a 1, you can see we have an array with one value of 1, which is a string. If I put a 2, it's going to just be an array with a 12. But if I put a comma and then a 2, then we have an array with two values, 1 and 2. So it's going to split it by the comma. Now I don't want to be able to have space like that, so what we'll do is add on to this dot filter. And filter is also a high order array method that allows you to return certain things based on a conditional. So we'll say for each tag, let's say tag.trim, which will just trim off any white space. If that is not equal to an empty string, then we'll return that. And then we just want a map, which will just manipulate the array. So for each tag, we want to return an array with the tag, but we want to trim. So we're just saying it can't be an empty string. Also, we're going to trim any white space. So now if I save that and I do 1 space, you can see that it's not actually added. The space isn't in there. And I could put comma 2 space, and the space is not added in there. And if I just do like comma and then another comma, it doesn't add another, it doesn't do anything because of our filter. All right, so now that we've established that, let's get these tags put into our HTML. So we'll get rid of that, and let's take the tags element and clear it. Otherwise, they're just going to pile up. So before we do anything, we'll just clear that. And then we'll take our tags, which is an array, and we want to loop through with for each. So for each tag, let's create a tag element with document.createElement, and we want to create a span. We also want to add a class to that, so let's take the tag element and let's class list.add the class of tag, and then we want to set the inner text of that. So we'll take the tag element and set the inner text to whatever the tag is, because we're looping through it here. We get each one and we're going to put that as the inner text. And then finally we want to take the tags element, so make sure you have the S here. This is the ID of, the div with the ID of tags, and we want to append child, and we're going to add each of those tag elements in. So if I go ahead and I do hello, so it starts to type down there as a tag. If I do a comma and I put in world, that's going to be the second tag, so it's going to separate it by the commas. All right, so we have the ability to create these tags. What we want to do next is have the ability to hit enter and then have it randomly select, and it's going to highlight and it'll give that cool little animation as well. So we'll do that in the next video. Okay, so we're able to create our tags here with commas. Now we want the random select functionality. So in our event listener, let's check to see if we hit enter. So we'll say if, and then on this event object we have a key property, and we're going to say if the key is equal to enter. All right, now if we hit enter, we're going to call a function called random select, which we haven't created yet. I also want to clear the input, so we're actually just going to wait a couple milliseconds before we do that. So in the set timeout, we'll pass in an arrow function, and we just want to wait 10 milliseconds and then clear the input value with e.target.value, and we're just going to set that to nothing. All right, so let's create random select down here, function random select. And for now, we'll just console log 1, 2, 3. And if I open up my console, and I can type stuff down here and then enter, then you see it fires off that function. And it also clears this up here. Now in the random select, we're going to go ahead and set a value of times, and I'm going to set that to 30. And what this represents is the number of times it's going to highlight each one before it stops. So it'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, and it'll go to 30 or whatever you put this to. And then we're going to have to set an interval, because this is going to repeat this highlight of each one, the highlight and the remove of highlight of each one. So let's create a variable called interval, and we want to use the set interval function. So for the time here, we want this to happen, let's say, every 100 milliseconds. And what we want to happen is we want to pick a random tag. So let's say const random tag, and set that to a function called pick random tag. And before we move on, we'll create that. So let's say function pick random tag, and we want to take all the tags, so we can use document.query selector all, and we want to get all the elements with the class of tag, which will be all the spans. And then to get a random one, let's return, and we're going to return tags. So tags, when we use query selector all, it's a node list that we bring in. So all of these will be put into the node list, which is similar to an array with an index. So the index is going to be random, and we'll use math.floor to round down, math.random, which will give us a random decimal. We just want to multiply that by the length of the tags array, or not array, but node list, which is similar to an array. So that'll give us a random tag. I'm also going to create 2 more functions down here just to highlight and unhighlight. So we'll call this highlight tag, and it's going to take in a specific tag element. And then we're going to take that tag element and we're going to just add a class with classlist.add, and we're going to add the highlight class. And then we want one to remove the highlight, so we'll call this unhighlight tag, and we're just going to remove instead of add, like that. Okay, so now back up to here. So we have this interval that's going to fire off every 100 milliseconds. It's going to pick a random tag, and then we want to highlight that random tag. So highlight tag, pass in our random tag. And then we want to unhighlight. So I'm going to have a set timeout here, which is going to take in a function, and we're just going to wait 100 milliseconds here to unhighlight. Okay, so in here we'll say unhighlight tag, and want to pass in our random tags. So with this, if I were to create my tags and then hit enter, you can see what's happening. Every 100 milliseconds, it's picking a random tag to start at, and then it's highlighting a random tag, and then 100 milliseconds after, it's unhighlighting. So that's just going to keep going forever right now. All right, so I'm just going to reload to stop that. And now what we can do is go under, let's see, so function, we still want to be within our random select, but we want to go down here, and I'm going to have a set timeout with a function, and I want this to run after whatever the times is. I want to multiply that by 100 milliseconds. So the 30 here, multiply that by whatever the time this is, which is 100 milliseconds. Okay, we could even put that, we could put that in a separate variable if we wanted to. But anyway, we want to clear our interval. So when you have an interval that runs, there's a function called clear interval to stop it. So we want to pass in our interval. Then we want to pick a random tag to stop on. So let's do a set timeout. And this is going to be 100 milliseconds. And inside this set timeout, I want to get a random tag. So once again, we'll create a random tag and set that to pick random tag. And then we want to highlight it. So let's say highlight tag and pass in our random tag. Okay, so this up here is causing that, shifting it to each one, highlighting and unhighlighting after a certain amount of time. And then this takes care of stopping it and just picking a random tag to land on and highlight. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These can be numbers or strings or whatever you want to put in here. Let's do up to 10. And then I'm going to hit enter. So it should run 30 times, and then it's going to stop on a random tag, or in this case number, but of course it can be anything. And let's try that again, same thing, which we did 1 through 10, and hit enter. So it landed on 3 last time. Now it lands on 1. All right, so you have choice 1, choice 2, choice 3, hit enter, and it's just a cool little application to pick a random choice. All right, so that's it. Okay, so in this project, we're going to create a live user filter where we're actually going to fetch a bunch of users from an API called randomuser.me. So we're going to fetch them, put them in here, and then we're going to be able to filter these users. So if I type in an R here, any user that has an R in either their name or their location is going to show. I'll do RO. Let's say let's search for this Roman guy. So ROM. And you see that the only user that matches that is this Roman Roberts. And if I delete, it's going to continue to filter. Okay, if I want to search for this Oliver, and if I delete, it's going to just match whatever I put in here. All right, so we're going to be dealing with the fetch API. We are going to use async await as opposed to the .then syntax for fetch, which returns a promise. So we'll first create the UI, style it with CSS, and then we'll fetch the data and we'll implement the filtering. All right, so we're going to get started on the HTML and CSS for this project. So let's jump into our index.html here for the project starter. So we're going to call this live user filter. And let's go ahead and get rid of this h1 here. So basically we're going to have a container here. And then we want the input, and underneath that we'll have an unordered list with the users. Ultimately, the users will come from the API that we're going to fetch from, through the JavaScript. But for now, we're just going to hard code them just so we can see it, we can style it. Then we'll move on to, making it dynamic. So let's create a header here. I'll go ahead and just create a class of header. And let's use an h4, give it a class of title, and say live user filter. And underneath that h4, I'm going to put a small tag and give this a class of subtitle. And here we'll say search by name and / or location. And then under that small tag is going to be our input, and the input is going to have an ID of filter, type text, and let's just add a placeholder to it. So placeholder will say search. Okay, so that's the header. So we can go underneath that div. Actually, we can use a header tag here. So use a header tag, and then underneath the header, let's do our UL, and I'm going to give this an ID of result. This is where we want our results to show up, and I'm going to give it a class of user-list. All right, so inside this UL, like I said, the list items are going to be generated with dynamic data, but for now we're just going to hard code them. So let's add an image here, and I'm going to use HTTPS, and let's use random user.me/API, which we're just going to get just a static image now, but later on when we actually fetch the users, the random users, it's going to be from the same API. You can use it just to insert a random user image, or you can make a request to get some JSON data for random users. So right now we're just going to do portrait slash, and then we can do like women/33.jpg. So if I save that, we're going to get a random image here, and then for the alt, we'll just use a name, say Sarah, and under the image here, we're going to have a class of user-info, and in here we'll have an h4 with the name, let's say Sarah Smith, and underneath that, let's do a paragraph with the location, we'll say Wexford, Ireland. And then what I'll do is just copy that list item, and I'll just put 2 more. I'm just going to use the same image and name. It's fine because, like I said, this is going to come in from the API ultimately. We also want an li for that just says loading while we're fetching the data, so I'm going to put that in as well. So there'll just be a list item with an h3 that says loading ... Okay, so that'll be our HTML. Now let's jump into our style sheet. So for the styling, let's see, we'll use this font for the body. I'm going to add a background color of hexadecimal F8, F9, FD, and see, display flex. We can get rid of the flex direction column. Want everything centered. Okay, that's good. Now the container wraps around everything. So for that, let's add a border radius of 5 pixels, and I'm going to add a box shadow. So for the box shadow, let's do 3 pixels for both of the offsets, 10 pixels, blur RGBA for the color, which is going to be black, and then 0.3 for the transparency. Actually, let's do 0.2. And why aren't we seeing that? Because I spelled container wrong. There we go. So now you can see the border radius with the box shadow. Let's also add overflow hidden, just so we don't have any scroll bars. The width, I'm going to set that to 300 pixels. Okay, so that should do it for the container. So the title here, let's remove any margin from that. So margin 0. And then for the subtitle, oops, let's go under here and add the subtitle. And I want to display that as an inline block, because remember that's a small tag, which by default is inline. And then I'm going to add a margin of 5 pixels, 0, 20 pixels. And I'm going to add an opacity of 0.8, which will make it, give it, fade it a little bit. And let's see, for the header, so we have a class of header. Let's add a background color for that, and that's going to be 3E57dB for that background. And then the color will be white. And then let's add padding for, let's do 30 pixels top and bottom, 20 pixels left and right. Okay, so our header is starting to look a little better. Now the input, we want to style that. So let's say the header input. I want to set the background color to an RGBA value of 0, 0, 0, so black, and then 0.3. So it just looks, has that kind of transparent look. To get rid of that ugly border, let's do a border radius. We're going to make this rounded, so 50 pixels for that. And the color of the text is going to be white. And let's set the font size So font size I'm going to set to 14 pixels. This is on the input. And then we're going to set the padding. Let's do 10 top and bottom, 15 left and right. And then let's make it go all the way across. So we'll set the width to 100%. All right. And I also want to get rid of this border here. So let's say header input focus. We want to set the outline to, let's do none. Okay, so that'll get rid of that ugly outline. Good. So the next thing I want to do is this user list here. So it's a UL and it has the class of user-list. And let's set the background color to white. And let's set the list style, we'll do list style type none, which will get rid of the bullet points. We don't want those. And then I'm going to remove any margin. And let's set a max height here of 400 pixels because we don't want this to be too long. We're actually going to have a little scroll here if, you know, to check out all the users in the list. And then let's do an overflow, because right now we won't have any scroll bars, but if we set overflow Y, so basically on the Y axis, let's set that to auto. And if we need scroll bars, it's going to give us this little scroll bar on the side, which doesn't look too bad. And then finally, let's set padding to 0 as well. And I'm just going to move that up next to the margin. All right, so now the list items. So we have our user list, and we want to style the LIs. I'm going to display as a flexbox, and let's set padding to 20 pixels. Okay, now let's see. All right, let's do the image. So we have user list image, and I want it to be rounded, so we'll use border radius, set that to 50%. That'll make it rounded. And let's do object fit cover, so we want the whole image to show in there. And then we're going to make the width and the height 50 pixels. Okay, so kind of small, but I think that looks all right. The user info, so we have user-list.user info. So for that, let's set margin left to take it away from the image. So margin left 10 pixels. That'll push it over. And then let's set on the H4. I'm just going to grab this. So the H4 in there, I'm going to set margin 0010 pixels. And for the paragraph, let's just set the font size to 12 pixels. We'll make that a little smaller. All right, so that doesn't look too bad. Let's have a border. We want a border in between, but we don't want a border on the last list item. So what we can do is say user list and then the li, and I'm going to use the pseudo selector of not, and in here we'll use the pseudo of last of type. So basically what we're saying here is, you know, any list item that is not the last. Then we want to add a border bottom. So let's say border dash bottom, and we'll set that to 1 pixel solid, and let's do triple E for the color. Okay, so we have a slight border there. Now we're going to have a class of hide, because when we start to filter these users, if it matches, we want to add the class of hide, which will basically display none. So let's say user list li, and if it has a class of hide, then we're going to want to display none. Okay, so if I manually come over here and put on one of these LIs a class hide, that's going to get rid of it. Okay, but obviously that will be dynamic because we want to filter it out with whatever we type here. So I think we should be good. The loading, the loading will show before any of these users show. Right now we just hard coded it in here just so we could see. So now I'm just going to remove everything, all these LIs except for the loading. So we'll get rid of those now that we know that those are styled correctly, and save. Okay, so basically our UI here is complete. We just now need to make it function with JavaScript, so we'll do that in the next video. Okay, so now we want to fetch some data, some users from a third-party API at randomuser.me. So this API is pretty simple. It's open, so you don't need any kind of key or anything like that. You don't need to sign up for anything. You simply make a request to randomuser.me/API, and you get, I think you get one user by default, but you can set a query param of results and get as many as you want. So we can actually I can show you this in the browser. I'm just going to copy this. So randomuser/API, if I run that, it gives me, let's see, yeah, it looks like it gives me one user. But if I put on this a query string, so if I do question mark and then results and set that, let's set that to 20, you'll see it gives me 20 users, and it gives you all kinds of fields. Your name, location with a full address, age, phone number, even password, username and password. So it's a really useful API for just like dummy data. So that's what we're going to use. So let's close that up, go into our script, and I'm going to start off here by just bringing in what I need. So let's bring in the result. Let's see, so in our index.html we have this right here, the UL with the ID of result. So we want to bring that in. So document dot, I'll go ahead and use get element by ID and result. And then we also want our filter, which is our input. So that has an ID of filter, or at least it should. Let's just make sure I've put that. Yeah, so ID of filter right here. Okay, so we're bringing in those, and the next thing I want to do is just initialize an array here called list items, and it's going to be just an empty array. So basically where we're going to put the data that we fetch. And let's create a function, and this is going to be asynchronous because I'm going to use async await. I'm not going to use the .then syntax. So I'll say async function, and we'll call this get data. And let's say const res. So this is going to represent the response from our fetch request. Now this fetch returns a promise, so we want to await since we're using async await. And we want to await fetch, and let's pass in here https randomuser.me/API, and I'm going to get 50. So we'll do, let's say results equals 50. Okay, now with the fetch API, we need to then call res.json to get our data. So let's create a variable called data, and let's await, because this right here, this res, that's going to be, this res.json here is going to be a promise, so we want to await that. And then that should give us our data, and I'll go ahead and just console log data just so we can test this out. And we're going to run this function right here, just say get data. And then if we go over here and open up our console, we should see, okay, so we get an object with two things. We have info, and this has, like, I guess pagination and stuff like that, the number of results, the page. So results is what we want, and this should have 50 different users. All right, so let's go down here. Let's get rid of this console log here, and I want to clear the results before we do anything. So we'll say results and set the inner HTML, whoops, results dot inner HTML, set that to just an empty string, and then we're going to have to loop through the data here. Actually, you know what we can do, since we need to do data dot results, because remember this gets an object with info and results. So we could go down here and say data dot results or we can just destructure here. So we can just pull out results from the data. Actually, yeah, that's fine because we called this results singular, so we can use results here. And then we can just grab that and we can loop through that. So for each, so we'll say for each user, because that's what it is. So each user, then let's go ahead and I just want to console log here user just to make sure we're getting this. Good, so you can see it's logging all the users. And let's construct an LI, because right now in our HTML we just have, we have the UL. We do have the loading here, which is going to show initially, but we want to construct the list item that are going to have the users. So let's do that in this for each. We'll say const li, and let's use document dot create element, because we want to create a list item for each of these users. And then we want to take our list items array, which starts off as an empty array, and then we want to push on each of the LIs. Okay, so I'm going to push that on, and then we'll take the li and add the inner HTML. So this is going to be, similar to the hard-coded HTML that we had for each user. It'll have the image and stuff like that, which we can get from this user object that's passed in to this for each when we loop through the array. So in here, let's say image and set the source, and we want to set this to, we're going to use this variable syntax, and let's take the user. Now we can access user.picture, and then there's different sizes. I'm going to do large, so user picture large. And you can see all this stuff if you make a request, either in your browser or with something like Postman or whatever. The alt, I'm going to use the user's first name. So we have user.name.first. And if you're wondering, where I get this name.first and stuff on this picture.large, every API is different. You just have to, you can look at the documentation to see what it gives you. Actually, we can see right down here where I logged it. Let's see, so you can see name. So name is actually an object with first, last, and title. So I'm getting the first. Picture should be in here somewhere too. So picture, we have large, medium, thumbnail. So it just depends on the API. I know when I first started learning this stuff, it confused me. Like, where did you get this from? It depends on the data that's being sent from the API. Same thing with, here where we get results. Some APIs, the data might just come as a one array or a single array, or it might come in different objects like a results object. This one also had an info object, so it just depends on the data you're dealing with. So this image here, let's finish this up, and then we have under the image we have a div, and let's give this a class of user-info. And in user info, we're going to have the name, so it's going to be in an H4, and that's going to be the first and last name. So let's go ahead and get the user.name.first, and then a space, and then we'll get user.name.last. And then underneath that, we'll have our paragraph, and this is going to be the location. So with this particular API and the data it gives us, we have access to user.location.city, and then I'm going to put a comma, and then I want to get the country. So user.location.country. Okay, and you can see that right down here. So in location, you have city, you even have coordinates, so you could place them on a map. I mean, you can do a lot with this little API. So that's that. Now we have the list item created. We added it to the array. We added the inner HTML. Now we just need to put it into the result, into the HTML. So we have that result that we pulled in. That's the UL. We want to append child because we're putting this LI into the UL. So we want to just pass LI in there. All right. So if I save that, you can see here, now we're getting 50, I'm going to close this up, we're getting 50 different users. Now the loading shouldn't be showing, and that's because it should be clear result. So I'm not clearing the results, the data I got, it's the result UL that I brought in. So let's save that, and now you can see that's not going to show. Now for the filtering, we need to have an event listener when we type in this input. So let's go right under where we call get data initially, and let's take the filter, which is the input, and let's add an event listener onto it. And we want to listen for any input, and when that happens, we're going to fire off an event that's going to call a function. We're going to pass our event object in, and then call a function called filter data that we're going to create. And we just want to pass in e, so our event.target.value, which is going to give us whatever is being typed in. So down here, let's create our function for filter data, and that's going to take in, let's call search term, so whatever is being typed in. And just to show you, we can console log search term, and if we open our console up here and I start to type, you can see we can capture whatever we're typing. So I'm going to then take the list items, which is the the array of users, and loop through. So we'll say for each, call this item. So for each item, I want to check. So we want to basically check to see if it matches the user. So we can do that by taking the item, say if the item dot inner text. So inner text for the item. Remember, list items is the li. So we're gonna go through the li's and check each item and check the inner text. And I'm gonna make it lowercase by using 2 lowercase like that, because even if we type in uppercase, I still want it to match. So we'll first convert it to lowercase, and then we're going to use the includes method. So we'll say if the inner text, when it's lowercase, or not when, but we're going to convert it to lowercase, if that includes the search term that's passed into this function, and we also want to make that lowercase, so they're both going to be lowercase, we're going to match that. If it matches, then we want to remove any class of hide. Remember, the hide class is just set to display none, right? This right here. So we want to just take the item and set class list dot remove, and we want to remove any class of hide. Else, so if it doesn't match, basically, if we're not matching what we type in, then we want to add the class of hide. So let's say item dot class list dot add, and then we want to add the class of hide. Okay, so now you can see we have, let's see, Roger right here. If I do R, so now it's going to filter anything that has an R is going to be included here. And this includes anything that's in here, so the name and location. So you can see these all have R's somewhere in here, right? Let's do RO, and now it's only giving us either names or locations with RO. G, and that leaves us with Roger. All right, if I do Roger and then I start typing more letters, it's not going to match. And if I remove, it's going to, if this, if it matches again, it's going to remove the class of hide. So it's just adding and removing that hide class as we type and as we delete. All right, so that's it. And you could apply this to any kind of list that you want to be able to search through. It's really easy to put together. But that's it. Let's go ahead and move on to the next project. All right, so in this project, we're going to build a content placeholder, and you can see this just looks like an ordinary card, has an image, some text, a user image or an author image, and some data. So if I reload or we come to this page, you're going to see this cool gradient animation that loads in about 2.5 seconds, and then the content comes in. So the way that we're going to approach this is we're first going to build out just the card with HTML, CSS. Then we're going to create this animation with CSS using basically just modifying the background position of a linear gradient. and then we're going to have JavaScript insert the content. And the content will just be hard-coded in the JavaScript, but of course you could fetch the data from some kind of API. All right, and of course you could have multiple cards and stuff like that. So that's it. Let's go ahead and get into it. All right, let's get started on our content placeholder project. So content placeholder. Now, the plan here is to just do the HTML and CSS, have our card, our image, card content, and then create our animation, like the wave type animation as it loads. We're going to do that within the CSS, and then ultimately the content's going to come from the JavaScript, like the images, the text, that's going to get input from the JavaScript after that little animation. But for now, we're just going to hard code all the content directly in the HTML just so we can get the card set up. So let's give this a class of card. That'll be our wrapper class. And no bootstrap or anything like that. We're going to style the card from scratch. So we have a card dash header, and then anywhere where we want to add the little wave animation, we have this animated dash BG class. And if it's text, it's also going to have an animated BG text class, because the text doesn't always go all the way across the card, but we want that animation to go all the way across. Now the header isn't just text. That class will go on like paragraphs, headings, and stuff like that. So this is fine for the header, but I also want to add an ID of header because I'm going to use IDs to grab onto it from the JavaScript. So we'll have an image in here, and I'm going to grab just a link to an Unsplash image. So we'll save that. You can see it's just a laptop. And for now, this is just going to take up the whole screen, but we'll fix that when we get into the CSS. Now under the header, so the header ends here, we want to have our card dash content. And in the card content, we'll have a card dash title. And I'm going to add the animated dash BG class here, and also the animated dash BG dash text, because this is actually going to be an H3. So let's add H3 right here. And let's fix that spelling. So animated BG text, and also an ID of title. And let's just say lorem 5 enter, which will just give me 5 dummy text words. So under the H3, we're going to have a paragraph with the class of card dash excerpt, and I'm also going to give it an ID of excerpt. And for the paragraph, I'll do lorem 10. And still within the paragraph, I want to have 3 of those animated lines. So I'm going to have 3 spans. So let's say span class animated dash BG, also animated dash BG dash text, and that should do it. So inside the span, I'm just going to have a non-breaking space. So let's say ampersand NBSP semicolon, and then I just want 3 of these. So I'm going to copy that down 3 times. Good. And then under the paragraph, so these spans should all be within the paragraph, because basically you're going to see these, which are going to be the animated lines, before this text loads. So under the paragraph, we'll have the author class, which is going to be where we have the profile image and the name and the date. So first we'll have a class of profile-img, and let's also add animated-bg, and let's give it an ID of profile_img. So for the image, let's throw this in here, and I'm going to use https random user.me/API/ portraits/men/45.jpg. Oops. All right. Now this image here, that's good. Under the div, so we have the profile image div. We're going to go under that, still within the author class, and let's say author-info. And in here we'll have some strong tags. I'm going to give this the animated class, so animated BG, also animated bg-text, and also an ID of name, and we'll just say John Doe for the name. Okay, underneath the strong tags we'll have some small tags with the same animated bg, animated bg-text, and let's do an ID of date. And for the date I'll say October 8th, 2020. Alright, so that should do it for the HTML. I just want to make sure I have these classes correct. So animated BG text. Alright, so if I mess something up, we'll come back to it, but I think we're going to stop here, and in the next video we'll go ahead and start to style the card. Alright, so we're going to get started on the CSS for this project. So I guess we'll just keep the Roboto font, that's fine. And the body, we're going to add a background, or let's do a background color, and it's going to be a light gray, so hexadecimal EC F0F1 is going to be our background. And we don't need flex direction column, and this other stuff should be fine. Now let's just say for the image we want that to have a max width of 100% of its container, so that's going to shrink up that image. And then let's start to add the styles for our card. So the card, I want to give it a box shadow, so we have our horizontal offset, let's do 0, vertical 2 pixels, blur 10 pixels, and color will be RGBA black with an opacity of 0.2. Okay, so you can see the outline here. Alright, now we want to have some rounded corners on the card, so I'm going to set the border radius to 10 pixels, and let's add overflow and set that to hidden so nothing comes out of its container, and then I'm going to have a width of 350 pixels on the card. And let's set the card header height. I'm going to set that to 200 pixels. And right now the text is kind of over the image a little bit, so let's style the card header image. So I'm going to just make sure object fit is set to cover, and let's set the height to 100% of its container and the width to 100%. So now you can see that the text is no longer over the image. Now the card content here, let's say card content. So I'm going to set the background of that to white. Actually, we'll use background color. And then I want to just set some padding to move everything away from the side, so we'll do 30 pixels padding. Alright, now the stuff that's in the card content, like the title, let's do that. So card dash title. I'm going to give that a height of 20 pixels and a margin of 0. And then the excerpt. So the excerpt, I'm going to give a color of hexadecimal 777, which is a gray color. And then for the margin, let's do 10 pixels, 0, 20 pixels. So that's the excerpt. Now for the author wraps around all of this. So author, I just want to display flex, which automatically puts it into a flex row. And then for the profile image, so profile dash image, remember that's the div around the image. So I am going to set the border radius to 50% because I want it to be rounded, although right now that's on the div and the image is basically popping out of the div. So we want to make sure we set overflow. We want to set overflow to hidden. Okay, so that'll make it rounded. We also want to make it much smaller, so let's set the height to 40 pixels and also the width to 40 pixels. So now the last thing is the author info, which is around the name and the date. So let's say author info. which I want to display as a flexbox, but I want them to be on top of each other, so the flex direction is going to be a column instead of a row. And then let's take any remaining content, so justify content to be around each element, so space around. And let's add a margin left to move it away from the image, so 10 pixels, that'll move the text away. And let's add a width of, let's say 100 pixels. Okay, and then for the small tag, we have author info small. I just want to change the color to AAA, which is a gray, and then add a little margin top, so 5 pixels, and there we go. So now our card is styled. So in the next video, I want to create the animation effects, and then ultimately this content, the images and the text, are going to come from the JavaScript. Alright, so we should be able to add our CSS animation and the JavaScript all in this video. So at the bottom of the CSS file, let's add in animated-bg, which we added on quite a few elements. And the way we're going to do this is set a background image to linear gradient, which takes in a direction. We want to say it's going to go to the right. And then we have 4 different colors that we're going to use, which are all just light grays. So I'm going to paste this in just because I hate typing out hexadecimal. So like this color will be 0%, and then at 10% this color, 20 this color, 100 this color. So that'll give us a very faint gradient. And then for background size on the X and Y axis, let's do 200% and 100%. And we're going to have an animation here, but I'm not going to add that just yet. Now for animate, we're not going to see any difference here because animated BG, well actually we do see a difference. Never mind, you can see the gray behind the text here. It'll also be behind the image, so if I go to this image right here and just comment this out, you can see the gray. There's no animation to it yet because we haven't added that, but we will. So we also want to deal with the text because we always want it to go all the way across. We want to display it as an inline block. Right now you can see the spans are just these little gray lines. We want those to be 3 lines that go all the way across. So let's add here animated bg-text, and I'm actually going to set a border radius here of 50 pixels, and then let's display as an inline block because I want to, let's add 0 margin, and I want to add a height of 10 pixels and a width. We want it to go all the way across, so that'll be 100%. So now you can see all the animated BG text go all the way across. So the next thing to do is add the actual animation. So this animated BG, we're going to add animation. We'll call this BG POS because that's what we're animating here, is the background position. And we're going to do it over 1 second. It's going to be linear and infinite, so it'll just repeat itself. And then we need a keyframe for that. So let's go down here and say keyframes. We called it BG POS. And basically at 0%, we want the background position to be 50% 0. And then at 100%, I want the background position to be -150% and 0. So we're just changing the position on the x-axis. So now if I save, if you look closely, you can see that effect. Okay, so it's just animating the background position of this right here, of this linear gradient, and it's giving us that effect. Now, what we want to happen is when we come to the site, we just want to see the animations here. In fact, if I comment this image out again, you'll see this animated BG class is making this effect. But I want to come to the site and I don't want this stuff to load until after 2 seconds or whatever. So that's where the JavaScript comes in. So let's go back into, or go into our script and bring in pretty much everything. We want the header. So document dot, let's use get element by ID, and I gave that an ID of header. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we want the header, we want the title, basically everything we want to add that animation to, and then insert the content. So title, excerpt, and we have our profile image. The ID was an underscore, profile underscore image. Then we have the name, should have an ID of name, and we have the date. Now we also have the animated classes, so let's say const animated, and we're going to do underscore BGs because there's more than one, so we have to use here document dot query selector all, because we're selecting more than one of these classes with animated dash BG. And same thing with animated dash BG dash text. We're going to do select all, and we'll call this BG underscore text. So these are going to be node lists, which are similar to arrays with all of those elements that have those classes. So let's create a function called getData, and basically this is where we define the data we want to insert. So we take our header in our HTML, and we're going to set that, and if we look in our HTML, the header right here has the image in it. So I'm going to just take this and I'm going to replace it with a non-breaking space, so NBSP semicolon, like that. So now the image is gone, but I'm going to put that in here because that's what we're going to insert. Why is this giving me? There we go. What is happening here? Are these on different lines? Yeah, so just make sure you fix any of this if these are not on the same line. There we go. So that's the header in our HTML. It's going to be that image. And again, this could come from, this image link could come from some kind of API or something like that. We're just hard coding it. So the title dot inner HTML is going to be this. So I'm going to grab this and cut that, and we'll just put NBSP. So now that title's gone, but we want to put this in here. Okay, next we have the excerpt inner HTML, and we're going to set that to, let's see, so the excerpt is going to be this text right here. So I'm going to grab that and we'll just replace it with NBSP. And you can see it's just taking everything away here, but we're going to insert it in a minute. This had a comma in it, so I just want to get rid of that and put this on the same line. Okay, that's the excerpt. Then we have the profile image. So the profile image inner HTML is going to be this right here. So again, we'll replace that. And paste that in. Okay, next we have the name dot inner HTML, which we know is going to be John Doe. And then we have the date dot inner HTML, which I'm going to set to October 8th, 2020, and we can get rid of both of those. We'll just replace it with this NBSP, that, and that. Oh, I forgot the ampersand. Okay, so everything is now gone as far as the content goes, and we just have it, you know, in this get data function. We're setting the inner HTML. Now, as far as the animated BG class and animated BG text, we want to remove those. So what we'll do is say animated. Let's do BGs first. Now remember, this is a node list because there's more than one. We use query select all. So what we'll do is loop through with for each, and we'll say for each BG, let's go ahead and remove the class. So BG dot class list, that'll give us all the classes, but there's a method called remove, and we want to remove the animated dash BG class. And we want to do the same thing with text, so we'll just copy that down, and this will be BG dash texts or underscore text, and we'll loop through and remove that class from all of them. Now this function isn't being called yet, so what we'll do is go up here, and I want to set a timeout because I don't want to call it right away. I want to show this placeholder for a second or 2 seconds. So let's say get data. So set timeout takes in a function and then the amount of time you want to wait. So the timeout, which I'll do 2500, which is 2.5 seconds. So now let's go ahead and save this, and after 2.5 seconds all this content gets inserted. Okay, and obviously you could change this to whatever you want. And again, this doesn't have to be hard-coded content. This could come from some kind of API. And of course you could have multiple cards. It just gives you an idea of how you could set up something like this placeholder animation. All right, so that's going to be it for this project, guys. I will see you in the next one.